Evening, a high-end restaurant in Boston. Warm amber lights glow, and soft piano music fills the air. Victoria Lang, a 34-year-old billionaire entrepreneur, is waiting for a blind date. She's used to elite investors, but tonight she's been stood up. After 20 minutes, she walks out to the dark parking lot. Her luxury car won't start. A man in a grease-stained jacket, holding his 9-year-old son's hand, approaches. "Battery connection looks loose," he says calmly. Victoria smirks. "You fix cars?" He smiles. "That's my job." She doesn't know the man fixing her engine was actually her date. Watch closely. Now, believe him. Today. Daniel Brooks was a man of rhythmic iron, honest sweat, and a silence that felt like a sanctuary. At 42, his face carried the subtle, weathered lines of a life lived close to the ground, a map of hard work, grease, and even harder losses. He was the owner of Brooks & Son Automotive, a small two-bay garage tucked into a quiet, aging corner of Boston, where the brick walls still whispered stories of a simpler era. He wasn't a man of labels, fancy titles, or high-speed social lives. He wore simple cotton shirts, heavy work boots that had seen thousands of miles of concrete, and usually carried a faint scent of industrial lubricant and cedarwood. In a city obsessed with status, Daniel was a ghost, the man who kept the engines of the working class humming while the rest of the world looked the other way. Daniel was a single father, a role he embraced with a fierce, quiet intensity that far outweighed any professional ambition he had once held. 5 years ago, his world had been hollowed out in a way words couldn't describe when his wife, Sarah, passed away after a long, exhausting battle with illness. She had been the heart of their home, the one who encouraged him to take over his father's old garage and find the hidden beauty in fixing what others considered broken. Since that day, Daniel had systematically dismantled his social life to ensure he was the anchor Ethan needed. He needed to be the father who was at the school gate exactly at 3 p.m., the one who coached the weekend basketball games, and the one who made sure there was a warm, home-cooked dinner on the table every single night. He didn't need a corner office. He needed to be a hero in a small house filled with Lego sets and school books. Ethan was 9 years old and shared his father's quiet, technical brilliance. While other children his age were distracted by tablets or chasing digital monsters on screens, Ethan was learning the difference between a manifold and a gasket. He would sit in the corner of the garage, his school books open on a workbench that his father had lowered just for him, breathing in the scent of motor oil while Daniel worked. He was the only person who truly knew the man inside the greasy jacket. He knew that his dad didn't just fix cars, he listened to them. He knew that his dad could tell if a cylinder was misfiring just by feeling the subtle vibration through the steering wheel or the rhythm of the exhaust. For years, Daniel had avoided the world of dating entirely. He was content with his life of two. He was happy with their Saturday morning pancakes and their Sunday afternoon hikes. But his best friend Marcus had been relentless for months. "Daniel, you're 42, not 100. You're a great man, and honestly, Ethan wants to see you smile for a reason that isn't just a perfectly torqued bolt. Just one dinner. No pressure, no expectations." Marcus had arranged a blind date through a mutual contact, a woman he described as brilliant but lonely, someone who needs a real human in her life. Daniel had hesitated for weeks before finally agreeing to show up at a high-end restaurant in downtown Boston. On this particular Tuesday, however, the universe seemed to have other plans. The garage had been a chaotic storm of emergency repairs since the first light of dawn. A local delivery fleet had experienced a multiple vehicle failure due to a contaminated fuel batch, and Daniel couldn't walk away from the work. He was a man of his word, and those drivers needed their trucks to feed their families. He worked through his lunch break and deep into the afternoon, his hands deep in engine blocks. By the time he finished the last repair, he was covered in grease, his shirt was ruined, and he was running nearly 40 minutes late for his reservation. He didn't have time to go home and change. He grabbed a clean work jacket from the locker, wiped his face as best he could with a rough rag, and headed toward the city with Ethan in tow, assuming his date had already left in a huff. He didn't care about the elite world of fine dining or the dress codes of the wealthy. He didn't care about the judgmental glares of the people in the lobby who looked at his boots and saw a servant. He just wanted to fulfill his commitment and go home to watch a movie with his son. But as he pulled his old truck into the back of the restaurant's parking lot, he saw a silver luxury car stalled near the exit, and he saw a woman standing beside it, looking at the closed hood with a mixture of frustration and absolute, crushing defeat. He didn't know it yet, but the disaster of his lateness was about to become the most important mechanical fix of his life. Victoria Lang was a woman who lived her life in 15-minute increments, her schedule a masterpiece of precision and power. At 34, she was a titan of the tech investment world, known for her sharp mind, her ruthless negotiation skills, and her absolute refusal to tolerate inefficiency. She was used to things working exactly as they were designed, from her international portfolios to her kitchen appliances. Her world was one of polished glass, sterile boardrooms, and people who always said yes before she even finished her sentence. But as she stood in the damp, cool air of the parking lot, she felt like a helpless child. Her six-figure silver sedan, a machine she had bought specifically for its unrivaled reliability, was currently a beautiful, expensive paperweight. She had spent the last 20 minutes sitting inside the restaurant, nursing a glass of mineral water and checking her watch every 60 seconds. Her blind date hadn't appeared. No text, no call. For a woman who prided herself on being a high-value asset, being stood up felt like a physical insult, a glitch in her perfect reality. She had finally decided to leave, her professional armor firmly back in place, only for her car to fail her at the worst possible moment. The silence of the engine was the loudest sound she had heard all night. Daniel walked across the asphalt, his heavy boots sounding a rhythmic, grounding beat that seemed to settle the frantic air around her. He didn't look at Victoria's designer dress, which probably cost more than his truck, or her expensive diamond jewelry. He looked at the car. He noticed the way the headlights flickered weakly when she tried the ignition. He noticed the slight acrid smell of sulfur in the air, the signature of a battery under stress. "Battery connection looks loose," Daniel said, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to cut through the fog of her frustration. Victoria turned around, her eyes scanning the man from head to toe with the clinical distance of a CEO. She saw the Brooks & Son logo on his jacket, the dark oil stains on his elbows, and the scuffed toes of his work boots. She saw a man who looked like he had just climbed out of an industrial pit. She felt a surge of professional skepticism, her defensive walls rising. She was used to dealing with high-end technicians who used digital scanners and wore white gloves. This man looked like a relic of the past. "Excuse me?" Victoria asked, her voice sharp with irritation. "The car just went through a full service last week at the dealership. It's a proprietary hybrid system. I'm already waiting for the manufacturer's roadside assistance. I don't think a simple check will help." Daniel didn't flinch at her tone. He had dealt with high-pressure systems and high-pressure people his entire life. He knew that a person in distress often lashes out at the first thing they see. "Roadside assistance will take an hour in this Friday night traffic," Daniel noted calmly, checking his own watch. "And they'll charge you $300 just to tell you what I can see for free. Pop the hood. I've got a 10-millimeter wrench in my pocket that says you'll be home in 5 minutes." Victoria hesitated. She looked into the man's eyes. They were calm, honest, and entirely unimpressed by her status. Then she looked at the little boy standing beside him. Ethan was looking at the silver car with wide, inquisitive eyes, as if he were studying a rare species. "You fix cars?" she asked, her voice softening just a fraction as the cold wind bit through her dress. Daniel laughed. A warm, genuine sound that made the parking lot feel a little less lonely. "That's my job. I'm Daniel. And this is my supervisor, Ethan. He makes sure I don't forget where I put my tools." Ethan stepped forward, pointing at the engine deck with a grin. "Dad, that engine is huge. It has the 12-cylinder configuration, right? Like the one in the vintage racing book you showed me?" Victoria found herself smiling, a real involuntary smile that broke through her corporate mask. "It should be huge, Ethan. It cost a lot more than it probably should have, considering it's currently not doing anything." Daniel reached into the engine bay, his movements slow and practiced. He moved with a surgical efficiency that Victoria recognized. It was the same focus she used during a hostile takeover. He didn't need a computer to tell him where the problem was. He used his hands to feel for the vibration of the circuit and the tension of the wires. Within 90 seconds, he had found the culprit. A loosened terminal clamp that had vibrated off its post during the drive over. He tightened it with a single, precise turn of his wrench. "Try it now," Daniel said, stepping back and wiping his hands on a clean rag. Victoria got into the driver's seat, her heart pounding slightly. She pressed the start button. The engine didn't just fire. It purred to life with a smooth, perfectly balanced roar that vibrated through the steering wheel. The relief she felt was overwhelming. She stepped back out of the car, looking at Daniel with a completely new kind of curiosity. "Thank you," she said, her voice finally losing its icy corporate edge. "I'm Victoria. You really just saved my night. I thought I was going to be stuck here until midnight, arguing with the dispatcher." "Don't mention it," Daniel replied, tucked the wrench back into his pocket. "It's a common glitch with these newer alloy clamps. They're light, but they don't handle the winter vibration well. You should have a mechanic swap them for the heavy brass ones next time you're in the shop. It'll save you a headache later." "You work nearby?" Victoria asked, lingering by the car door. Daniel nodded, gesturing down the street. "A small garage 2 blocks away. We're not as fancy as the dealership, and we don't have a marble lobby, but we usually find the noise before the computer does." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them no longer awkward, but filled with a strange, electric connection. Victoria realized that the man in the greasy jacket was the most interesting person she had talked to in months. He wasn't trying to sell her a vision or ask for a seed round. He was just a man who knew how the world worked. She didn't know that she was currently looking at the disaster she had just been complaining about inside the restaurant, and he didn't know he was looking at the woman who was about to change his life. The rain began to mist over the parking lot, creating tiny, shimmering halos around the streetlights. Victoria leaned against her silver car, her posture relaxed for the first time all day. The tension in her shoulders had vanished, replaced by a quiet hum of intrigue. She watched as Daniel helped Ethan put his heavy school backpack into the cab of an old, well-maintained pickup truck parked 3 spots away. It was a humble truck, but it was spotless, a testament to the man's character. "So, Daniel," Victoria said, her voice carrying a soft, thoughtful weight, "what were you doing near a place like this on a Tuesday night? You don't exactly look like you were here for the 5-course tasting menu and the vintage wine pairing." Daniel laughed, ruffling his hair with a calloused hand. He looked down at his oil-stained clothes, noticing a fresh smudge on his sleeve, and then back at the elegant woman in front of him. "Actually, I was, or at least I was trying to be. I was supposed to meet someone here for a blind date at 7, a high-stakes meeting of the hearts, as my friend Marcus put it. But as you can see, my shift ran late, a delivery fleet broke down, and I didn't exactly have time to make myself presentable or even find a tie." Victoria froze. Her hand, which had been resting casually on the door handle, tightened until her knuckles were pale. A strange, cold shiver of realization ran down her spine, followed by a sudden, intense heat. "A blind date? At 7 o'clock? Daniel nodded, a hint of genuine embarrassment coloring his voice. "Yeah. Marcus set it up. He told me she was a high flyer in the investment world and that I should probably try to impress her. I feel bad for standing her up, but I figure she probably left the second she saw the clock hit 7:30. I don't blame her. A man who's late to the first meeting isn't exactly a good investment, right? I just came by to see if the hostess had a message or a very angry note." Victoria felt the air in her lungs vanish as if she'd been struck. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him this time. She saw the kindness in his hazel eyes, the unshakable strength in his hands, and the way he treated his son with a profound, unscripted respect that no boarding school could ever teach. She thought about the man of status she had been expecting. A man in a charcoal suit and a silk tie who would have spent the first 20 minutes listing his assets and his summer homes. And then she looked at the man who had just fixed her life with a 10-millimeter wrench and a smile. "Blind date?" Victoria repeated, a small, knowing smile beginning to tug at the corners of her mouth, a smile that reached her eyes. Daniel, my date didn't show up either. I sat in that velvet booth for 20 minutes, staring at a glass of expensive mineral water and wondering if I had somehow become invisible to the world. Ethan, who had been listening intently from the open truck door, looked between the two adults. His eyes widened as the simple, beautiful logic of the situation clicked in his 9-year-old brain. Dad, wait, what was her name again? The one on the piece of paper you kept in the glove box? Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wrinkled business card. He squinted at it under the street lamp. Victoria, he read quietly, his voice catching. Her name was Victoria Lang. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the distant hum of the Boston skyline and the soft, rhythmic patter of rain on the hood of the car. Victoria stepped forward out of the shadows and into the full glow of the light. "Your name is Daniel Brooks?" she asked, her voice hushed with wonder. Daniel stared at the card and then at her. The shock on his face was total. You're the Victoria? The one from the global investment firm? The one Marcus said was brilliant but scary?" Victoria laughed, a rich, vibrant sound that filled the empty parking lot and made the night feel warmer. "I am, although I'd like to think I'm a little less scary when my car is actually running. And I think you're late, Daniel. Very late." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, a genuine boyish blush creeping up his cheeks. Victoria, I am so incredibly sorry. I've had a day that didn't go according to the manual. I should have called, but my phone died under the chassis of a delivery truck at 3. I figured you were long gone. I just came by to offer an apology to the air." "I was gone," Victoria said, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of amusement and relief. "I was in my car, ready to go home, pour a drink, and tell my friends that blind dates are a catastrophic waste of time and a terrible ROI. But then, well, the car cooperated. Or rather, it didn't. It seems my engine knew more about the schedule than I did." Daniel looked at the silver car he had just fixed. "So the breakdown was a lucky break?" "The best one I've had in years," Victoria replied, stepping even closer. They stood there in the mist, two people who lived in completely different worlds, finally seeing each other without the filters of status, expectation, or resumes. Victoria didn't see a greasy mechanic anymore. She saw a man who was steady in a crisis and humble in his power. Daniel didn't see a billionaire. He saw a woman who was brave enough to laugh at her own misfortune in a rainy parking lot. The disaster of the night had been recalibrated by the truth, and it was perfect. Victoria looked at the restaurant entrance and then back at Daniel. The professional mask she had worn for a decade had completely melted away. "So, Daniel Brooks," she said, her voice full of a new playful energy. "Are we still on that date? Or do you have a strict policy against dating clients?" Daniel looked at Ethan, who was currently giving him a thumbs up from the driver's seat of the truck. "Dad, you definitely should," Ethan whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet lot. Daniel smiled, looking at Victoria. "I'm not sure they'll let me back in there, looking like this, Victoria. This place has a dress code that usually involves a lot more silk and a lot less 10W40. Victoria walked over and took his hand. She didn't care about the grease. She didn't care about the oil smudge on his thumb. "I own the development group that holds the lease on this building, Daniel. If they want to talk about dress codes, they can talk to me. Besides, I think the man who fixed my engine is the most impressive person in that room tonight." They walked back into the restaurant together. The transition was jarring. The warmth of the interior, the clinking of expensive silverware, and the hushed, polite laughter of the city's elite. As they reached the hostess stand, the same woman who had looked at Victoria with pity 20 minutes ago now looked at Daniel with a mixture of shock and disapproval. "Ms. Lang," the hostess stammered, her eyes darting to Daniel's jacket. I didn't realize you were returning. I'm afraid your table has been—" "Our table is right where I left it," Victoria said, her voice regaining its quiet, undeniable authority. "And this is Mr. Brooks. He's my date. He's a bit overqualified for your dress code, But I think we can make an exception for the man who keeps my car on the road. The hostess nodded frantically. Of course, Miss Lang. Right this way. Daniel sat down across from Victoria, feeling absurdly out of place among the white linen and the heavy crystal. But when he looked at her, he realized that she wasn't looking at his clothes. She was looking at him. Ethan was seated at a small side table nearby, where Victoria had personally arranged for a 3-scoop sundae with extra chocolate sauce. Is he always this helpful? Victoria asked, gesturing toward Ethan. He's my lead technician, Daniel smiled. He sees the details I miss. He's the reason I'm still standing. Victoria leaned in, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. You know, Daniel, I've spent my life looking for high-performance people. I've looked for the best resumes and the biggest bank accounts. But tonight, I realized I was looking for the wrong metrics. I was looking for the shine, but I forgot to check the engine. Engines are honest, Victoria, Daniel said softly. They don't lie to you. If you treat them with respect, they'll take you anywhere. People are a lot more complicated, but I've found that if you're honest with them, they usually respond the same way. Victoria realized then that the disaster of being stood up was the best thing that had ever happened to her. She had been looking for a partner in a boardroom, but she had found a soul in a parking lot. The man who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty was the only one who had finally cleared the smoke from her life. The dinner lasted for 2 hours. They didn't talk about investment portfolios or logistical supply chains. They talked about the thrill of a first car. They talked about the quiet peace of a Sunday morning. Daniel told her about Sarah, and Victoria told him about the loneliness of the penthouse. The distance between the mechanic and the billionaire vanished, replaced by the simple, profound connection of two people who had finally stopped performing. As they walked back out to the parking lot, the rain had stopped and the stars were beginning to peek through the clouds over Boston. This was the most successful disaster I've ever been a part of, Victoria said, leaning against her car. Daniel smiled, gripping his toolkit. I told you, machines are honest. Your car just knew we were both in the wrong place at the same time. Will I see you tomorrow? Victoria asked, her voice low and hopeful. Not for a repair, for coffee. Somewhere simple, somewhere where the coffee doesn't come with a lecture on the beans. Daniel looked at Ethan, who was already fast asleep in the truck. He looked back at Victoria. I think I can manage that, but on one condition. What is it? You have to let me drive, Daniel winked. I don't trust those hybrid clamps yet. Victoria laughed, a sound that made the cold city night feel warm. Deal. As Victoria watched the old pickup truck pull away, she realized that her life had fundamentally shifted. She had been leading with her ego for so long that she had forgotten how to walk on the ground. Daniel Brooks hadn't just fixed her car, he had fixed the rhythm of her heart. The story of the mechanic and the rich woman didn't end with a headline or a merger. It ended with a quiet realization that the most important connections in life aren't the ones we plan for. They are the ones that happen when things break down. And the only person left to help is the one we never expected to see. True success isn't about how much you can own. It's about who you're with when the world gets quiet and the engines stop. Victoria Lang drove home that night, catching the reflection of the harbor in her rearview mirror. For the first time in a decade, she wasn't alone in the light. Sometimes the best parts of our lives are hidden behind what we think are disasters. Real value is found in character, patience, and the willingness to help a stranger. Never judge a person by the grease on their hands. They might be the only one who knows how to fix your heart. If you believe that the best relationships begin in the most unexpected ways, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, would you ever go on a blind date that started with a broken car?